Good evening. We're on the air again with another edition of Pachios on the News. Thank you for being with us tonight. We have a guest that is familiar to all of you. All you have to do is look at the set, look at the person on the camera, and say, I know that guy, and it's not me. You know this guy because his name is Pat Callahan. And for how many years were you an anchor at WCSH?
Well, I did. I was 3 years at WLBZ in Bangor, and then 40 years at WCSH in Portland. We're all now, they call us News Center Maine, and so that was more than 40 years.
More than 40 years. So some of you watched them every single night. Tell me.
I hope so.
You hope so. But was the News Center, the 6 o'clock news, on your ratings, how did that do versus the other local news programs?
Well, starting in around 1985, our weekend newscast became the #1 weekend 6 and 11 o'clock newscast.
Yeah.
The reason for that was the local owners of the company, the Rhines-Thompson family, decided they weren't going to carry NBC sports on the weekends that might preempt the news. That infuriated college basketball fans, golf fans, many others. They'd put on a Ma and Pa Kettle movie or something. But their goal was, said, we want people to count on the fact that our newscast at 6 o'clock will be there every Saturday and Sunday night. I was anchoring that newscast and producing it. Bill Green was doing sports. And obviously we had something people liked, and we were there. The other stations would have sports on or something else. So once that started to happen, also, we were getting some new people in the mix. So by 1986, WCSH became the dominant 6 o'clock newscast in Portland and has stayed that way at least till I retired. I don't look at the numbers anymore.
Yeah,
they don't share them with me. But we became the dominant station. But what's funny about that, and it's easy to say, oh, well, it's because we were putting out a much better product. And I like to think we were. But we had very talented people at WGME Channel 13, WMTW Channel 8. But in the 80s, people were still leaving their set on the same channel. Like if they were watching Merv Griffin on Channel 13, they would leave that show on, and then the news would come on, and that helps their ratings. One of the biggest breaks we got was when Merv Griffin retired. And so people were now sampling, and they seemed to like what we were putting out. So that's how that changed. So for more than 30 years, I was part of what was the most watched newscast in Maine, by far. In fact, many ratings periods, more than the combined audience of the other two stations.
So the reason I asked you that question is I figured that was the answer. I've never asked you that before.
No, you haven't. We've known each other a long time.
Yeah.
That has never come up.
No, I've never asked you that before. But I think I knew the answer would be. Otherwise, I wouldn't have asked the question. And if I thought I'd get an embarrassing answer.
No.
Yeah. So, and I understand. Sometimes exceeded the combined viewership of the other two stations.
Yes, which was very gratifying, and we were humbled by it. It was important to us.
Yeah. You talked about the owners. Did the owners ever dictate what they wanted you to cover and to talk about?
The business side, such as the sales department, and the editorial/news side, completely separate. Some of us barely knew who the salespeople were just because they're on a different floor in the building. We knew what they did. They went out and sold the ads that helped pay our salaries, and otherwise we wouldn't have jobs. But the only thing that when it was family owned, as I say, it was the Rhines-Thompson family, which goes way back in Portland. In fact, this year marks the 100th anniversary of the first radio station in Portland, WCSH Radio. And WCSH stands for Congress Square Hotel. That's where they broadcast from. That building still exists on Congress Street. And by that was 100 years ago. And then by 1953, they started in the television business as well, and has been an NBC affiliate all that time. But essentially, as I like to put it, the owner was in the store. And when I came to Portland to work here, the owner was Mary Rhines Thompson. She was the her family owned the company, and she was the president of the company. So she's up in our 4th floor office, and you want to talk to her about something, you take the elevator up and knock on her door. If you want to make a pitch for a story that may cost some money, you know, you do it through your news director probably, but you could make the case. Say, we'd like to cover this, and it might be expensive, but we think we can make it up in advertising, sales, or what have you. And they said, okay, do that. They never said, you should cover something this way. The only thing they insisted on is that we all participate in public service programs, and not just on air, because news is a public service, but the world's largest garage sale, the Sidewalk Art Festival, which lasted for decades down in Monument Square, all up and down Congress Street, really.
That was sponsored by WCSH?
Right, right. And these were all things that said, we're part of this community, and we want to do everything we can, not just on TV, but also in the community that helps support various causes. And the reason for that was very simple. When you're granted a television broadcasting license, as the Thompson family was in 1953, that came with the responsibility that you will be able to make money off the public airwaves. In return, we expect you to give value to the community through information and through public service. And if you look back far enough, excuse me, news was often considered a loss leader for TV networks. It was something they did because it was their charge to do so and helped attract viewers, helped them build their brands. But you didn't really make a lot of money on newscasts. You made your money on primetime shows and so on. The Tonight Show for NBC, or the Today Show. It wasn't until 60 Minutes became popular that CBS recognized this show is so popular, it's often the #1 show of the week, we can make more money on this. Suddenly all the networks said, well, gee, we want to start making money on news too. And that changed the model in many ways. And it's there's no reason to go into it too deeply, but that was one of the tipping points where you started to see the business model change a little bit.
Mary Rhines Thompson grew up in Portland.
Right.
So when you go to talk to her, or if anybody discussed with the owners anything happening in Maine that had public impact, or she knew what you were talking about.
She was plugged into the community, and in fact, at one point, this may have been during the 80s as well, there was discussion of perhaps moving out of Congress Square, which is, for those who don't know, it's right in downtown Portland, across from the Portland Museum of Art. And it's not a big space. And so as the station got bigger, you wanted more space. Many stations moved out to business parks and built their own television stations. But the Thompson family said, no, we belong here in downtown Portland, so make it work.
And it's the only station in downtown Portland, right?
Right, and has been for a long time.
Yeah.
But that's the way they wanted it, and that's the way it has stayed.
Now, of course, what's happened is chains, big national chains, TV chain, television station chains are taking over. They're buying these organizations. Yours was bought by a journalistic company, Gannett Company. So they were in your business, and they were pretty well known and respected, weren't they?
They were. I mean, here's what changes when a corporation buys local television station. First of all, no longer is the owner in the store. And I can give you an example of something that happened that told me how things had changed. And again, you're right. Gannett was a big newspaper chain and owned dozens of TV stations. So they were in the news business, and that was good. That meant they let us do the things we did, and they also kept alive many of those public service projects for a long time. You'll recall in the 1990s, when Senator George Mitchell had left office and was now negotiating in Northern Ireland for the all-party peace talks. And I was able to convince our owners in the building, we should go over there and cover this, because here's a guy from Maine who is trying to solve not just a 30-year-old problem, a problem that really goes back centuries in the tribalism of these countries. And I said, we can help people understand it, and we'll also be talking about somebody that they know from this state. And they said, yeah, do that. Knowing it's not a cheap thing to do, to send a crew to Northern Ireland for a week or 10 days and pay all those expenses.
And did you take cameramen with you?
I did. Just one camera operator.
Yeah.
The two of us went. And as George Mitchell always did, he made sure to make some time for us, and you know the demands on his time back then. But he also recognized people in Maine should understand what's going on here. Many people didn't get what the conflict in Northern Ireland was about.
Yeah.
They looked at it as a civil war between the North and the South, like our American Civil War, and it wasn't that at all. I learned a lot doing it, and I was able to bring that home. Flash forward a couple of years, and Senator Bill Cohen is now Secretary of Defense. And the Secretary of Defense, at least in those days, was not just the guy in charge of the troops and the tanks. He's a diplomat. And he goes to our allies and makes sure everybody's on the same page about the defense posture that we take. And Senator Cohen said to me, or Secretary Cohen at this point, he said, if you'd like to come along with us, I can give you some access and you can show how we do it, which would have been fascinating. I really wanted to do it. Now we're owned by a company in Virginia who said, no, we're not spending a lot of money on that. It wasn't censorship, and it wasn't, they didn't want the content. It's just, it's not something that we as a small Maine station should be able to afford. And that said to me, all right, this is one of the things that's changed. I can't go to them and personally make the case. And they might be able to say, all right, we may overextend ourselves this quarter, but we'll make it up next quarter. When someone else is managing your budget, that's the biggest thing that happens. When you're owned by a corporation, they manage your budget, and you've got to meet their expectations. But I will say again, for those who are curious about it, Gannett and then Tegna, which became the name of the spin-off of the TV stations, never interfered in the newsroom and said, this is what you should cover and how you should cover it. All they cared about was what you're doing, do it well. Be fair, tell the story right, do it like professionals. And as long as you did that, you didn't have a problem.
So, who is Channel 13 WJN owned by?
Well, when they were family owned, that was Guy Gannett Publications, which owned the Portland Press Herald and the other papers. They were sold, I don't remember what year it was, but probably in the 90s, just as our station was, to Sinclair Broadcasting. That's another major owner of TV stations. And so I'm not privy to what goes on in their newsroom and what the relationship was like. But Sinclair is an operation that has more of a reputation for wanting to amplify certain voices or ideas, if only in their editorials, because they do national editorials.
Well, it's a well-known, it's a conservative organization. I mean, it's conservative politics, and the owner, the principal owner and CEO, it's based in Baltimore suburbs in Maryland, but the principal owner lives right in Cape Elizabeth.
Right. And you know, maybe that's one of the reasons that I've always believed that their news operation was honest. The people who were working there were sincere about trying to cover all sides of a story, do it fairly, and do it well. So, you know, people think, oh, we're all big rivals in the TV business. But Maine's too small a place for us to be mad at each other. You know, so right. We find you get to know people in the field or at gatherings, and they're doing the same work you are, and they do a good job at it. But they did have to put up with a company that broadcast national editorial opinions. Whereas when our station, that was owned then by Gannett, they had a local editorial board. And people will remember Fred Nutter, who had been a newscaster and then news director and finally editorial director. And so he would come on after the newscast was over and talk about some local Maine issue of importance. And if you disagreed with him, you could reach out and they'd put you on the air next week so you could talk about it and offer that balance. So while there was editorializing going on, it was walled off from the news department, and it was local, not national.
Yeah, and I think I know something about Sinclair and Channel 13 because I was involved in politics years ago, and in 2004, the incumbent Bush was running against John Kerry, and there was a film that put together on swift boats. Kerry, as folks will remember, was in Vietnam in combat on swift boats, and there was a swift boat film meant to attack Kerry politically. And all of the Sinclair stations, including Channel 13, were required by the bosses to run that film, and that's the first time I became aware that
Yeah.
now with this chain business, you could get a lot of politics that wouldn't be so evident with local ownership.
Yeah, that's true. And again, we've seen it play out in recent weeks and months. We saw that the owners of CBS and Paramount were trying to make a deal to acquire be sold to another bigger company. And they had to negotiate with the people in the Trump administration to get approval. And, there was no stated quid pro quo, but changes were made. For example, canceling Stephen Colbert's late night show as of this coming May. They let him stay on the air until May. And they argued, probably honestly, the late night shows don't make the kind of money they used to make, so this is a business decision. But I think most people can look at that situation and say, there's clearly more than just that going on.
It definitely was not just a business decision.
And then, and then just 2 weeks ago, when, after the shooting of Charlie Kirk, Jimmy Kimmel, another late night host on ABC, made some remarks that people found offensive or inappropriate. And rather than, his bosses said, well, we want to turn the temperature down, so we're going to take you off the air for a while. It was an indefinite suspension, which I'm sure Jimmy Kimmel thought was the end of his job. And part of that was because a big chain called Nexstar is in negotiations to buy Tegna, which is the company that owns Channel 6 in Portland and Channel 2 in Bangor. And they want to make sure the FCC gives them approval for that to make their big deal. So they'll do anything they can. Donald Trump doesn't care for these late night comics. And so they say, well, what if we make that go away? Now, again, none of this is done in the open, but it's fairly easy to see that's a factor here in what's happening.
There's no question about it. I mean, look, the idea, political power is subject in our system, not the Russian system, but in our system, to certain restraints and restrictions and norms. And if you didn't have those restraints and restrictions and norms, someone could get plenary power, total power in this country, like Putin.
Right.
Nobody can tell him what to do. And so, but you have to destroy the machinery, the separation of powers, the allocation of power between the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive branch has to be kind of eroded and destroyed in order for that to happen. And most important, you have to destroy the credibility and legitimacy of the press.
Well, and that's part of the Donald Trump playbook. He has always said the media is the enemy of the people, which of course is not true, but you say things often enough and there are people who will buy it. And remember though, getting back to the whole network thing, the reason that Jimmy Kimmel came back on the air so quickly is that his indefinite suspension, which might have become permanent, was sparked by the head of the FCC going on a podcast and saying to the owners of ABC, which is the Walt Disney Company, they need to do something to control him, and we can do this the easy way or we can do it the hard way, and if they choose the hard way, then the FCC is going to have some work to do. That is a pretty clear example of government trying to suppress free speech, and that's why there was such an outcry about it, because they said the quiet part out loud. And so that's why a corporation like Disney, once you get enough outraged people not buying your product anymore, that hurts the bottom line. We can't have that. So they stood up and said, no, we're going to bring him back. And eventually, both the Sinclair and Nexstar stations, both big ownership groups, brought the show back as well.
They caved.
Well, you can call it whatever you want.
But
that was the reason. Had you not had that obvious statement, not a thinly veiled threat really at all, that might not have played out the same way it did.
I say they caved, but I use that word.
You're a lawyer.
Well, no, but I use it for others too. Trump's got a lot of people to cave. He's got a lot of organizations that caved, including law firms in my business that absolutely caved. They're afraid of him.
Well, let's talk about how this is different from when we were young guys.
Yeah.
And you have a couple years on me, and you were working in Washington, first at the Peace Corps and then for President Lyndon Johnson. Back then, presidents had enemies, quote unquote. Richard Nixon was the most obvious one to say, I have an enemies list.
Right.
And mostly what he would do about that is maybe have their taxes audited by the IRS. You know, it was not benign, but it's not a giant hammer to try to crush someone. And he had all kinds of media people on it. They wore it as a badge of honor when that stuff came out. But we've talked about the fact that President Lyndon Johnson, who could be a pretty hot-tempered guy, did not care for it when some of his allies would take votes against him. What would he do?
Well, he'd been around a long time, so he really knew what the norms were. Lyndon Johnson would not have uttered 1% of the things that come out of the mouth of Donald Trump for fear it would destroy him politically.
Mm-hmm.
And now,
and it would have, yeah.
It would have destroyed anybody. Think of this. Think of Jimmy Carter saying some of the things that this guy does or says or does. Carter would have been, I don't know if they'll throw me off this show, but Carter would have been lynched.
Yeah, run out of town on a rail.
Run
anyway.
out of town on a rail. So those were different times. Look, Johnson didn't like the press because they criticized him.
Yeah.
He called them up. He called them up. You said this and this is wrong.
He called him in the middle of the night.
He called him in the middle of the night. But I was the deputy press secretary, and I know for a fact he wouldn't go after him publicly. Never would he try to erode it because he looked at the press as his only channel to the public, to the voters. I need them to reach my constituents.
At that time, that was true.
Yeah.
But you also talked about when senators who were his friends and allies would then have committee hearings about something he had done or a policy he supported, and behind the scenes, he probably was pretty loud about it.
See, Trump is protected by the Republicans in Congress. They circle the wagons. Whatever he does, he's not accountable because they make sure why do they do it? Because they think he's a great man? No, because they're afraid of him.
Yep, because he'll attack them and get someone to run in a primary against them, they lose their jobs.
Demean them and humiliate them. Humiliation is the #1 currency. Humiliate people. So, but Johnson, he was furious. For instance, I always tell people this. Democrats brought down Lyndon Johnson's presidency. He couldn't run again because of the protests against the war that were being stirred up by members of the Senate who were his friends. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee finally decided in 1966-67 to have hearings on the Vietnam War. Johnson tried to get him to stop. He sent the Senate liaison guy up there, tried to get him to stop, and they wouldn't. They said, we're going to do it. We're going to expose what's happening in this war. We're not getting the truth. He was furious. Somebody said to him, I know who, but I'm not going to say who. Somebody said to him, you know, Mr. President, you could go after those guys. It was Fulbright of Arkansas, Morse of Oregon, Frank Church of Idaho, all Democrats, all people he served with in the Senate when he was Senate Majority Leader, friends of his.
Yeah.
And they said, no, we're going to do this. And he was so frustrated. So this person said, you can go after them. You can hurt them. He looked at the person like the person was from Mars. And he said, we may need them next week or the week after. We need friends, not enemies. But this guy that we've got now has disproven that theory. Well, he makes enemies all the time, says horrible things, burns bridges, and it doesn't hurt him.
Well, we'll talk more about why that is in just a sec, but I want to point out the flip side. If Johnson was brought down by Democrats, Richard Nixon was brought down by Republicans.
He was indeed.
I mean, it began with someone with the courage of a Bill Cohen.
Bill Cohen.
On the on the House Judiciary Committee,
right,
taking the vote after, he's a Republican. He wanted to support his party's president, but he said, when I read all that material and I saw what had happened in Watergate, I had to vote on the articles of impeachment. Not all of them, but he did vote for several of them. And he said, I assumed my career in Washington was over. And it wasn't until the smoking gun tape came out, which proved Nixon's involvement, that he was kind of off the hook. And you'll recall, it was Republican senators like Barry Goldwater who led a contingent to the White House to tell President Nixon, you're going to be impeached and you're going to be convicted because of we have this evidence. So you need to do what you need to do. In other words, that's why Nixon decided to resign.
3 Republican senators got in a car and made an appointment and drove down to the White House and said, we're no longer going to protect you.
And who was the chair of the Republican Party then? George H.W. Bush.
Yeah, that's right. We're no longer going to protect you. And
But when you say that Trump doesn't have to muzzle himself at all.
No.
And part of it is because the Republicans in Congress and the Senate will say, well, we want to support him because if we don't, our people will turn on us because he's going to get a primary challenger. But the other part of it is, unlike the days when Johnson and Nixon were facing their foes, there was no such thing as social media. There were newspapers, there was network TV and radio. And most of us consumed our news from the same places, generally speaking. Every city had several newspapers. You had your town newspaper for that stuff. But nationally, people watched NBC, and CBS, and ABC. They read the New York Times and the Washington Post. Those agencies covering Washington, exposing what had gone on with Nixon, publishing the Pentagon Papers, defying the law, but until the court stepped in and said, no, you can't have prior restraint. So we all had a sort of a mutual set of facts. Social media allows anybody to spread their own ideas, which in a sense is a good thing. If you think of it as it's the public square and you get on a soapbox and you talk about what's important to you, that's since this republic began, that has existed. But it's so easy to disseminate false information to so many people, and that's often what is the reason that someone like Donald Trump can get away with this stuff, because people buy into what he's selling. And if they're not getting any other independent sources of news that have actual trained journalists uncovering facts, finding things that are hidden from the light and bringing them to the light, if you don't have that, then anybody can say anything and conspiracy theories run wild.
And so we have a lot of people that are badly informed in our society.
I think that's true. Considering that we have the world's information at our fingertips, we should be the best informed people in history, but it's not really true.
Yeah, it's interesting what you just said, but we should be the best informed. I, as a lawyer, I am trained to look at facts, to find facts. That's the whole training of a lawyer, to get to the bottom of something. And I talk to people about the president now he accuses the other side of having weaponized the law to go after him. And so he says he's going to do away with that. And in fact, I have to say, I brought this with me.
You came prepared.
I didn't know what this subject
what a good lawyer will do.
But this subject. But this is a presidential action. This is a presidential declaration when he first became, first day.
An executive order.
Executive order. And he goes on to say that, the Democrats have weaponized the community against perceived political opponents in the form of investigations, prosecutions, civil enforcement actions, and other related actions. So what he's complaining about. And he says, that's wrong. Shouldn't do that. And he says, Americans who spoke out against who spoke in favor of his prior administration were persecuted by the Biden administration. He said, and the country has been engaged in an unprecedented third world weaponization of prosecution power to upend the democratic process. It targeted individuals who voiced opposition to the Trump administration's policies. So he's really upset about this. He does not believe in weaponizing the legal system.
Sounds pretty solid.
Yeah, he just doesn't. He thinks that's a terrible thing. Now, I'm being sarcastic because hopefully the people that watch this program are aware of how ludicrous this statement is coming from him.
You know, and to understand the source of that, you can go back to Trump's first term, and when he made it clear he thought the Attorney General should be his personal advocate.
Right.
Not understanding that the Justice Department acts independently. And
He understood it, but he didn't want it.
Well, he didn't want it, but ironically, the excuse he used was when he'd get an Attorney General who was not doing what he said, he said, "Where's my Bobby Kennedy?" Now, that's because JFK chose his own brother to be Attorney General.
Yeah.
And there's no doubt that Bobby Kennedy had more influence than any other Attorney General on an administration.
No question.
And so, because he was there in the office when things happened, but he also took care of business on the, as the Justice Department should on civil rights and so forth.
Yeah.
But because Kennedy was able to do that and have his brother, Trump seemed to take from that, the Attorney General should be my personal attorney. And that's kind of what he's got now.
And what he really wanted was his Roy Cohn, who
Well,
was his mentor.
that's
his
true.
lawyer and his mentor and his playbook. Trump's playbook comes from 2 or 3 different sources, but it's an old playbook.
Yeah, and this is when Trump was coming up in the New York real estate world.
Yeah.
When he became acquainted with Roy Cohn, who those who don't know should look into it, but political operative, one of the most ruthless men ever on the political scene.
Ever. So, interesting enough, because I do like to dig around things, there's a reporter from the Village Voice, which was a prominent paper in New York back in the last century, who wrote a long book about Trump that was published in 1991, long before we ever dreamed that Donald Trump would be president of the United States. And it's a very in-depth investigatory book, heavily footnoted about Trump's conduct during those years in the business world in New York. Anybody who's interested, I have the book. I'm happy to loan it to people. I sent away for the book. It's out of print, and I found.
I wonder if the main libraries must somewhere have,
They
must have a copy.
probably have this book, but it's a very, very interesting book because it's just nothing's changed. He's operating as president just as he operated in the 1980s and 1990s, running gambling casinos.
And what was Roy Cohn's playbook?
Roy Cohn's playbook was, you know it, but it was, go back at them worse. If they say anything about you, go after them. Don't just defend yourself. Go after them personally.
Second, deny
Right.
anything that's brought against you. And then others have used that too.
Yes. Oh yeah. No. And the other part of it was to humiliate people. If you humiliate people, finally they'll just shrink and go away, and they won't be a problem for you. So his is humiliation. Like when he was running the first time in 2000, he would say something about the personal attributes of his opponents. They're ugly, or women were ugly. Mm-hmm. He'd say all of these things. So it's pretty rough stuff, but he learned it from Roy Cohn. Now, do you think, Pat, you've communicated with people in Maine now for 50 years. Do you think they're not aware of that it never registers with them, that he behaves that way?
Well, I think it does. I'm not a psychologist or anything, but I've always thought one of the things that makes Donald Trump successful with a lot of Americans is that he speaks in a simple way, a very clear way about how he feels. And I think that makes other people feel empowered to also speak their mind about people or things they don't like. He also speaks of victimhood a lot. And Donald Trump wins a lot of things. I mean, he always brags about how he always wins because he's the best businessman, best politician. And he has great political instincts, there's no denying it. But there's also, I was victimized because our election was stolen in 2020 against all. There's no evidence of it, but he keeps saying that. And there are a lot of Americans, I think, that the government doesn't work for them and has left them behind, and that somebody else got what you were supposed to get. That's why a focus on immigrants, for example, works so well in this day and age, is that These people are coming here from somewhere else, taking jobs that should have gone to me or some other white male, as frequently as where this is coming from. So appealing to that kind of mindset of people who think they've gotten a raw deal and saying, I'm going to fix it so you'll be taken care of, that's very appealing to them. And I'm sure there are plenty of Republicans, even those who have voted for Donald Trump, who do recognize what you say, that his mannerisms and his method of attacking are not something we're used to seeing in this way. But let's remember, Donald Trump came to national prominence not just because he was a New York real estate developer, but because he was on a successful reality TV show. And I use those quotation marks because, that's as scripted as anything else. But it's about regular people, supposedly. And he was a tough guy. And they didn't do, at the end of the episode, they hadn't accomplished his business mission. He fired them. And that became his trademark. You're fired. And people thought that was kind of funny. They liked that.
Because they like seeing people humiliated.
Yeah, and so look at what happens now. Every day is another episode of a reality show in which there's a new crisis that he's talking about on social media or at a news conference, but I'm going to fix it. But at the end of the day, he will be the winner, having fixed whatever this problem he's pointed out is. And if you look at it in those terms, that every day, let's face it, I can't think of any other president who has been on our radar so much every day of their presidency.
Never, ever in American
obviously,
history.
you always know who the president is, and they have great influence, but not all the time. And
or with this much chaos.
Well, that's right. And so you can't look away.
No.
You might want to, but you can't, and it's important not to.
The reason I asked you that question, do you think they understand this, is certain notions are getting sold by the president, and you wonder whether people are believing it. Now, I talked to somebody the other day about the Comey indictment. I don't care about Comey. I'm not a defender of Comey's, but I didn't think there was much to it.
Right.
And the person said, well, yes, he said it out loud. He said, I'm going after my enemies. He's admitted he's weaponizing the justice system to go after his enemies and make them miserable. That's what's going on. He admits it. We don't have to try to figure that out. No. He tells us that. So this guy said, so they did it to him, which they did. They went after him. So he's going to do it to others. So it's okay. They did it to him. Well, there's a big difference. There's a big difference. So I looked up, I go and look at this stuff. So here is the entire indictment from the grand jury.
That's pretty thin.
Mr. Hone. 4 lines on the second page, and that's it right there. And all it is he was asked by Senator Cruz in 2024 in a hearing, did you authorize one of your deputies to leak something about an FBI investigation to the press? Okay? And and he said, no, I didn't authorize that. And so there is no evidence that he authorized it yet. There is no evidence. There is somebody from the FBI said, I think he might have, but I'm not sure. That's it. Yeah. So they know they don't have a case.
And as in your experience, is this something that's going to get very far in the court system?
No, it's not. But he doesn't care. He wants to ruin the guy's life and
make him pay a lot of money to defend himself.
Pay a lot of money. And then they put out a press release after they filed this. This is a piece of garbage. And I'm not defending Comey.
Right.
I mean, if the guy's guilty of something, what Comey said is true. He said, look, let's have a trial. Let them put on their evidence, and let's have a trial, and we'll see what happens. When Trump was indicted, he didn't say, let's have a trial. Let them put on their evidence, and we'll see. He didn't even say, I didn't do it. Not once, folks, did he ever say those allegations are untrue. Never said that. All he said is, I'm being persecuted, this is a witch hunt, but never, it's untrue. So look, just to give you an example, here's the indictment of Trump for election interference. 45 pages of facts.
Yeah.
There's a long
All
investigation.
documented, footnoted.
Documented, all quotes. Here's the one, you know, the whole thing about the confidential documents, the top secret documents that he would do, that began as a ridiculous thing. They said, you got this stuff.
Just give it back.
Just give it back. And he said, okay, we'll give it back. And so they said, come down here, we'll give it to you. They gave it to him. But what went on, we all found out, is that inside Mar-a-Lago, at a relatively low level, there were a couple of squealers, rats. And so they called up the Justice Department and said, you didn't get it all. Most of it's still here. So the Justice Department goes to a court and gets a subpoena from the court, subpoenaing all the documents that they retained.
Mm-hmm.
They gave them the subpoena, and in this indictment in Florida, the federal court in Florida, they got all the quotes from Trump himself, or what he said to people, how they can hide them. It's all in there.
But that case got dropped.
Both cases got dropped, but he'll never be accountable if anybody took the time to read these indictments. Read the Comey indictment. That'll take you approximately 90 seconds. Read the indictment, the indictment in Florida on the secret documents, and read the indictment of trying to overthrow the election results. You'd be appalled. But here's what I'm getting at. People that consume the news, people who are interested in these things, people who talk about it, people who read social media about this and get these characters, they never read this stuff. They don't know what's in it.
Right.
So people can characterize it. Trump himself said there's nothing in there. This is a hoax.
Mm-hmm.
And incidentally, this Comey thing where it claims he authorized somebody to leak something about an investigation. She says, Pam Bondi, when she announced this investigation, she said it was about Russiagate and trying to connect Trump with Russia.
Yeah.
The indictment says that James Comey had authorized somebody at the FBI to be an anonymous source in a news report regarding an FBI investigation concerning person number 1, Hillary Clinton.
Well, you know, it's actually...
This is like, Hillary must love this.
It's almost funny because, in a way, James Comey helped Donald Trump get elected the first time by reopening the investigation of Hillary Clinton's email server 11 days, I think it was, before the election, which, for anybody who already had doubts about her, that may have sealed the deal and said, no, forget it.
Imagine Hillary reading this indictment, said, oh, the son of a gun, Comey, he's alleged to have authorized somebody to leak something that hurts me, Hillary, not Trump, Hillary.
But let's talk a little bit again about the historical overview of how politicians and politics have changed. And let's face it, anybody who's ever been elected president has made mistakes, probably has some character flaws. For example, when John F. Kennedy, who was the most skillful user of the media that we'd seen in the 20th century to that point, he knew reporters were unlikely to report on his
sexual adventures.
Exactly, his philandering.
Yeah.
And he knew if they reported on that, he was finished. Mm-hmm. They also knew if they knew about his medical history, he never would have been elected. And they kept that secret. And they got cooperation from a lot in the media who probably did know things about those, but they didn't report on them then. So certainly the media was not fully doing its job, perhaps as they should have been. Through the 60s, as people became more disillusioned with politics, partly because of the assassination of Kennedy, many who didn't believe it was just a one person, that it was some conspiracy, they still believe it, many of them do, and Lyndon Johnson trying to push his great society and raise people up from poverty and what have you, gets undone by the Vietnam War because he can't stop it. He can't walk away from it. Right. He said, I can't be the first guy to lose a war.
Right.
I mean, do you agree that is that really what undid him?
What undid him is he knew, you know, people, again, my lawyer's instincts. You want to know what Lyndon Johnson's trap was? Listen to his own voice. You can go online, LBJ telephone tapes, and you can listen to tapes. Listen to a tape. Just go online and ask for the telephone tape between Lyndon Johnson and Senator Richard Russell of Georgia. Goes on for a half an hour, and he says, "I'm trapped. I'm trapped. I can't get out. We can't win." It's a terrifying thing because 56,000 Americans lost their lives, and this guy saying, "I'm trapped," it's a tragedy. Yeah. And so
there's a loss of faith in government happening for a lot of reasons, and it peaks kind of with Richard Nixon and Watergate.
Yeah.
And he resigned. So we figured, okay, then the system worked, right?
System worked.
It worked the way it should. And Gerald Ford, people still argue about it. He pardoned Richard Nixon because he thought the country did not need to see a president on trial.
Right.
This is over. Let's move on.
Yeah.
Most likely cost Ford re-election.
Yeah.
But he did it because he believed that was the right thing. Jimmy Carter comes in. Nothing ever went right for Jimmy Carter.
Nothing.
From energy prices to
a totally failed presidency. A good man.
Yeah.
And
a smart guy.
A smart guy.
But not a great politician.
Terrible.
So we move on from there, and Ronald Reagan promises morning in America. Ronald Reagan, the best communicator since JFK to hold that job.
Correct.
And yet he...
And a decent man.
I think at heart, yes. I believe that's right.
And a decent man. You know what the founders thought, those who drafted our Constitution, was they had all these checks and balances, and we don't want a tyrant, we don't want a king. How do we stop that? And so they put a lot of stuff in there. But Madison, who was the chief draftsman, said, none of it's going to work if you have a leader without any virtue. Virtue, some virtue, not totally, but some virtue is essential.
And we were kind of spoiled throughout the 20th century and the first part of the 21st century in that the system worked because we agreed there were norms that had to be obeyed. Yeah. Many of us assumed, well, they're doing that because that's the law. But it isn't always the law. It's really just, look at what happened. Until FDR, no one ever sought more than 2 terms as president because George Washington only served 2. And they said, it's enough for him, it's enough for me. Until FDR did it, that was not a law, it was just a custom that said you don't run.
Right.
And my mom, I remember telling me she grew up in those times, and she said that some people wouldn't say Roosevelt's name. They would just call him that man in the White House, because he drove them nuts. Here he was, though, a patrician, a rich guy who was really looking out for the poorest and most underprivileged Americans and doing it in a very effective way, but he stayed too long at the fair, so to speak.
He did.
He didn't know when to get off the stage. And that can be a problem for politicians because every politician tells you, that I'm the only one who can fix this. I'm the only one who can solve these problems. And look, you don't run for that office without a colossal ego.
Joe Biden, a man of very modest talent, thought that he was the only person who could fix anything, and he was a disaster.
Well, that's right, because he and the people closest to him would not say to him, you told everyone you were going to be a bridge to the future, and you were going to then fix things, make them normal again in your view, and get bills passed, infrastructure bills, the CHIPS Act to bring some manufacturing back to this country. He got those things done. He easily could have said after the midterms in his first term, you know what? I really mean it when I say we're going to move on to something else. I'm getting older. I'm going to get this job done. I'm going to keep working till the day it's done. But I'm going to step aside, and we'll let a new generation of Democrats and Republicans have this field to themselves and let the chips fall where they may, because his ego, presumably, would not allow him to do it.
It was his ego.
Things have changed drastically. And it's unfortunate because I also think Joe Biden is a decent man. And I always thought of him as a small-town politician writ large. He's one of those guys, when you're talking to him like we are, it's like you've known him a long time. He makes you feel that way. And that was key to his success.
He's a very good retail politician.
Exactly.
But, he's not the brightest bulb, but he's a very good retail politician. But his legacy is ruined. He ruined his own legacy. I also think that when the historians get through 60 or 70 years from now assessing Donald Trump, he will go down as the most uniquely bad human being ever to be president of the United States. But that's for the historians.
For those who believe character counts, and there's an excellent book called that, Character Counts, with essays about each of the presidents up through, I think, Barack Obama. I forget how far it went. And by the way, you're talking about those Lyndon Johnson tapes. Michael Beschloss, the presidential historian, has a great book compiling the most important conversations, and you can hear them as well. And I think that's a wonderful insight. And you know, people talk about, oh, how dumb it is to record all these conversations, and you know, your secrets get out someday. Well, it's the reason we know so much about Lyndon Johnson, about Richard Nixon.
Lyndon Johnson had 3 personal secretaries that sat right outside the Oval Office. One of them lives and has lived here for a long time in Falmouth. Lived in Portland first, lives in Falmouth. She's from Texas, no connection to Maine, but came with her husband to live here many years ago, 35, 40 years ago. So she told me one time what the answer was. He forgot the taping system was on. He did every time he'd take a call.
It was automatic.
It was automatic. He didn't turn it on. It got clicked on automatically whenever he took a call. So he didn't think about it being on. He just acted normally and said what he wanted to say. So it is a great insight, and those tapes would answer a lot of the questions about Johnson. He knew he was in trouble, and he knew he couldn't run again.
Let's focus a little bit on how Maine politics has changed. In your time, you were active, you ran for Congress once, about 1980.
You don't mention that. You know.
Be proud of being willing to take that step.
That's
you know,
true, yeah.
Not everybody will do that. It didn't work out the way you wanted, but you've been involved in Democratic politics mostly. But you know, you've known all the politicians, the major players here.
Yeah.
And the first governor that I covered in Maine was Joe Brennan.
Yeah.
I came to Maine, and I didn't really know much about Maine politics. I'd grown up outside of Boston, so politics is the game. If you're an Irish American,
and you are an Irish American.
Betcha. And so that's the sports pages, you know, the political stuff. And so when I knew who Ed Muskie was because he had run for vice president and then for president in '72, so I knew who he was, and I was quite intimidated the first time I met him because I'd heard so many things about his temper and all that. He was very nice to me when I reported on him after he retired. But anyway, so Joe Brennan was there, and I thought, oh, this is good. The Irishmen are in charge here because it was Brennan and Dave Redmond and you know, all those guys, Barry Hobbins and so forth. Everywhere in the State House, I felt at home. One of the things that Joe Brennan did, which I thought at the time seemed boring, he held a news briefing every week. Whatever was on your mind, he'd be in his cabinet room. People would set up their microphones and cameras, ask him about anything. You'd find out where he's at. If you're working on a story during just a regular workday, and you needed a comment from the governor about something the legislature's doing, if he was in his office, he'd say, yeah, come on in, you got 5 minutes, and he'll talk to you, go on camera, because he knew, as you talked about, that's how you reach the people of Maine in those days. You wanted them to understand what you're doing and why, and so you don't treat the media as the enemy. You don't always like what they say and write about you. I guarantee you they don't. But they don't blame you for doing it because they recognize that's the job. So in Maine, so I covered Joe Brennan, then Republican Jock McKernan, also pretty accessible guy, you know, wasn't hiding in his office away from people. Angus King, independent, guy loves being on TV, and he'll affirm that next time you talk to him. You know, he was always great at that. And then John Baldacci, I'd covered him on the Bangor City Council when I first got to Maine. Yeah. And so I'd known him since he was just a young politician, and he was a great retail politician in his time. Right. He was every weekend. He's at some supermarket opening, or he's somewhere where people can see him and talk to him. In Maine, they expect to get to know you. It's a small population state, so they want to know who you are and what you're about. And John would throw these spaghetti suppers for a cause, because his family ran Mama Baldacci's restaurant. And so we got accustomed to having access to the chief executive of the state. Paul LePage gets elected. Paul LePage, I promise you, was more surprised than anybody when he got that nomination. Remember, those 7 people were in that Republican field.
Yeah.
And then when he came out on top, I remember the first time I talked to him, I said, if this guy has any money and exposure, he'll do well. Because he was making some really interesting comments about weaning people off welfare.
Yeah.
You know, not just having a limit, but, you know, tapering off, that kind of thing. I thought, that's logical. But the people around him kept him shielded from the media because they thought the press was the enemy. They didn't quite use the same language that Trump picked up, but it was the same idea. The first time I'd seen that in our state, and really the first time, you know, nationally, they know, the presidents know they have to deal with the media. So you might as well try to make it something where they're not out to get you. And LePage and his people thought we were out to get him because he'd say some things that some found outrageous. But I always felt they did him a disservice. Had he been easier to access and talk to more often about his policies and his ideas, he might have had a better relationship with the media and the public to say, yeah, I'm trying to accomplish some things here, and here's how we're going to do it. But mostly it was, you know, he'd made some comment about the NAACP or something, and that's what people want to talk about because it's the shiny object. And so I will say I respect Governor Janet Mills, but she also has been less accessible generally throughout her term than the predecessors I mentioned earlier, which surprised me because she, like Paul LePage, can handle the media.
Right.
They know what they're talking about. They don't need to be protected. You know, they're smart people and they know what's going on. And I've seen evidence of it with Paul LePage when his guard is down. He can be a very affable guy.
Right.
Doesn't mean you have to agree with him. The fact is, he's a smart guy.
I've had him on this show twice.
Well, and then you know.
And he is an affable guy.
Yeah, and so they never let that out. Not often enough, and they did him a disservice. And of course, he hired those people, so it's kind of on him too.
No, I agree. Listen, this has been fun. I've enjoyed this. The time goes very quickly.
Yeah. Let me give my quick pitch in for the political podcast that I do now.
Yes,
it's
quickly.
It's called In the Arena, and it's done by WMTW TV, Channel 8. It posts every week on their website on Thursdays. You can find it in their political section on their website. It's also on every podcast platform. Ethan Strimling, Phil Harriman, and me every week solving the world's problems.
Here you got it. If you want to solve the world's problems, tune in, Channel 8.
Find In the Arena.
In the Arena. Thanks very much for coming.
Thanks, Harold. I enjoyed it. Let's do another hour.
Yeah, let's do it.